But one of the things that came to light in the last little while of thinking about our work and how we could work in partnership is that educational change happens when collectives form. And in that, this work is actually a result of collaborating with colleagues in the Department of Education. And I'd actually like to recognise at the outset colleagues Mary Neville and Pascal Burton, without whom this work wouldn't have been possible, as well as key colleagues in the Institute who are here, including Lenore Adey. What you'll hear about today is, and we put it in front of you today for genuine exploration about how do we seek to, and I'm going to say drive improvement, leverage improvement in writing. This is looking at what deliberate actions are needed to support all young people to learn to write and to write to learn. So it's those two aspects. Those words you will be very familiar with by the end of the presentation. We'll be talking a lot about progression and plateau. And if there's one big issue facing this country, and I know we've heard a lot about it in terms of Indigenous peoples, but closing the gap, we know that education does not close the gap in schooling from prep to year 12. And so what we are challenged by is how do we actually meet the needs of all learners throughout those phases. Our focus today is undoubtedly in the middle years. And just as a bit of a headliner, what we've done is we're focusing on the middle years and what's been traditionally called the middle years slump. And we're going to be provocative in saying to you, this slump is not necessarily about engagement. How many of you are familiar with the term middle years slump? You've read about it, you've lived it with adolescents, and you've had a diet of research telling you about young people's engagement and learning and how they start to disengage. I actually want to put in front of you the insights from and the evidence from teachers themselves about how they go about writing pedagogy, and I want you to think about the middle years slump by the time we get to the end and say, so what, how do we reframe the middle years slump in terms of shifts in pedagogy? Now, why else are we doing this? Because it struck us a little while ago that Australia doesn't have a large-scale evidence base in the teaching of writing. I mean, it's simply a fact. We've got NAPLAN, and park your views about NAPLAN to the side. We have that as a large-scale evidence base, and it's, I think, valuable as that base, but it doesn't tell us about the teaching of writing. It doesn't tell us about how writing is being learnt in schools. So we thought, what would it be like to start to explore the teaching of writing in this country and start to build a large-scale evidence base on the teaching of writing? And that's what we set out to do. And that's what you'll hear about today. And the question for us all in this room is, what does the evidence reveal and what do we need to do? So how many folk are policy? I'm not saying you're not teaching, but I'm saying how many are here primarily because you're coming from the domain of policy primarily? Okay, teaching and research. And that's the beauty of this group, because we can speak across spaces with a view to answering that question. What do we need to do? And Jim, if you can pull us back to that in the end to maybe get people's sense of what might be top actions out of the sorts of discussions we have today, I'd really appreciate that. I don't know whether you saw this one in the media. Who saw it? Anybody shocked by it? Essentially what it was saying is that Australian children lose 2 years of their education, and it's saying that in fact 13.8 years of school by the age of 18, but it's only equivalent to 11.6 years. Now it was in the drawing on an article in The Age, and it's drawing on data from the World Bank Human Capital Index, and it actually says relative to other countries in our part of the world, Australia is performing, but not relative to other countries in the world. You've heard this before, and I know you've heard about PISA and TIMSS and all of those large-scale standardised tests. We know, of course, that large-scale standardised tests aren't going to drive the improvement, and I don't think this sort of data brings us any joy. It can bring a lot of questions for us, and that's why I think Australia would be well advised to start to build its own large-scale evidence base around key issues about writing pedagogy, for example. Every state and territory, drawing on the NAPLAN data, knows that writing is a shared priority. We could have pulled out any state, but because we're in partnership with Queensland Department of Education on this particular occasion and event, we pulled out Queensland, and we can see there the below national minimum standards in the bands 3, 5, 7 and 9. And even, see, these are not our figures, these are ACARA figures as published. If you stop and think, what are the implications of this for young people as they head towards employment? What are the implications for their life chances in writing? Irrespective of what you're thinking about NAPLAN as an assessment of writing, this calls us to stop and take heed. So the Australian Writing Survey was born. As in any good project, you've got to decide what are you going to focus on. So we set out to construct the survey around what we think are 8 priority areas. If you have a look at those, you'll get a sense of what the scope was. And we put initial teacher education in there as well, because we thought that was a critical piece to understand, if we're talking about the teaching of writing, how well prepared are beginning teachers, how well prepared are our teachers to actually teach writing. What we wanted to do was to collect information about teachers' preparation in the teaching and assessment of writing, but we wanted to hear from teachers themselves. We wanted to hear what teachers had to say about their practices and what they're prioritising and spending time on. We had 600 teachers from 55 schools across 7 regions. And we'd like to recognise from the outset that this work is not possible without that strong commitment by our teachers. The participating schools were chosen with the support of the Evidence Hub, and we had a sampling frame. We prioritised a range of different types of schools, but all of them had upward trending performance in writing from 2011 to 2015. We had across a range of demographics, region and school size, and we wanted to make sure that we're including NAPLAN participation rates over time as just an element in our consideration of the schools. This was not driven from the department's point of view. Mary, chime in, tell me, add as you wish. This was not driven by NAPLAN scores. Even though I've shown them at the very beginning, it wasn't driven by NAPLAN scores. It was driven by a genuine interest in finding out about the teaching of writing, and for the teachers to be able to give to us information to build that account of writing as it's happening in classrooms.
And that also was our dilemma as people who worked in support and tools and resources for schools, but are we hitting the mark? And what database are we using to actually base our decisions on? So a survey like this was going to help us to see the real needs of teachers in the teaching and writing space.
And to tune into those needs, for us to work across research and policy and practice to see what the possibilities were. Let's get on to this notion of progression and plateau. This actually came from the data itself, which we'll be introduced to this afternoon. And progression refers to a significant change, that is a statistically significant change, either an increase or decrease in the predicted probability of teaching the activity between two successive schooling stages. Now remember, we're really interested in the middle years, but we wanted to find out what's happening in the early years, and we wanted to find out what was happening post the middle years. So even though you're going to hear a lot about what's happening in the middle years, it's surround sound by those very early years and post the middle. So plateauing, the absence of a significant change in the predicted probability of teaching an activity between two successive stages. If we lived in Nirvana and I said to you, what would you like to be the picture of the data? You might like to say, well, you'd like to see a build, a constant build. Would you? You'd like to see later in the years of schooling, there's a systematic, deliberate build on what's come before. That's what I would like to see. I mean, people who are in the middle years, what do you assume about what's happened before? Readiness to proceed. Sorry?
It contributes to what is going to come next.
Yes. So you're making some assumptions about coherence. So my question to you as you're listening today is, what assumptions can you make about coherence in the pattern, the pedagogical pattern over time, in your school, in your system? So that was our sampling distribution. Clearly we wanted all of our regions involved, and with the support of our colleagues in the department, we had Southeast Queensland, North Coast, Far North Queensland, Metropolitan, Darling Downs, Southwest, Central Queensland and North Queensland. There's your female and male split. Underrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander teachers. Jump in if there's any questions or issues. There's been a lot of attention to this notion of middle years and middle years research. And we can actually look back and see that by the time we hit the 1990s, can you remember the wave of work that came through from the US around an intense period of change? Psychological change, biological change, young people orienting to their peers, and what are the implications of all of that for young people's learning, and how do we make sure we're sustaining that engagement through to middle years. You familiar with any of those studies? So if there's this PowerPoint can be made available to you as you wish, and we obviously can provide those list of detailed studies, but they're right across the country. The 1992 to 95, that Victorian Quality Schools, that was a study of school and teacher effectiveness, and that was the names like Hill, Rowe, Holmes, Smith and Russell. Wide range of names of people, ministerial reviews, Donna Pendergast's work is in here, and the Meeting in the Middle study that we did with the department to understand the connections between assessment, pedagogy and learners' educational disadvantage. We have learned a lot, but I'm going to suggest we have to shift the spotlight on the middle years to what is the pedagogical picture to support learners from the earliest of years through to year 12. What is the pattern of the pedagogy across the years? And how do we grow a culture of inquiry into those phases? And I'm going to suggest that between the phases, that's a very dangerous space for young people. And I'll elaborate on that as we go along. So what are we going to be talking about today? ITE preparedness. And as you've heard from Jim, we're absolutely committed to, and as a group of people in education, the preparation of teachers for quality learning in our classrooms. We're interested in time and the notion of opportunity to learn. In brackets, practice. My other, if I was going to put red letters up on anything, I'm going to say this needs to be the era of focusing on expertise and evaluative expertise and developing young people's knowledge about writing to include their knowledge about the metacognitive aspects of writing and how to self-improve, especially in this era. So we've got the sustained writing, time. And the length of writing, you'll hear about that. You'll hear about how teachers are working with assessment standards and goal setting. We're only talking about 500 teachers, or 600 teachers. It's a large enough sample for us to be able to say something useful. Larger sample would be good. If we can repeat this and go larger, that'd be even better. But we're talking about then this focus on writing teachers and the identity of the writing teacher. What does it mean to have expertise as a writing teacher? What sort of expertise are we talking about? You know, in the US, they don't have literacy per se. They have reading teachers, they have writing teachers. And then of the policy priority around writing, pedagogy and online composing processes. So the move to online. And what does that mean? We've seen all the discussions around what difference does it make if young people are using a keyboard for NAPLAN. I'm taking a different slant on this to say the composing process online is, we know from the research, significantly different from the composing process when you're using old technologies. So the explicit teaching of writing and the developing of expertise in writing online, reflecting on the writing, monitoring the quality of the writing, the goal setting of the writing online is a different activity from when you, and I'm saying for folk in the room who have been doing their secondary schooling in, say, the last 10 years, you would be very familiar with this. I had a time when I had a typewriter. You have typewriters, and sort of the keyboarding experience is quite different from what young people have, and the multimodalities are critical in how people are writing online now. So it's not a linear version of text, as you well know. So teacher education, let's start with middle years programs, and this is where historically they've focused according to Barn-Croswell. Learner, developmental, sociocultural orientation, questions around innovative pedagogical and curriculum assessment processes and approaches, middle years philosophies, policies and wider youth issues, and an attempt to combine expertise with understanding of middle years learners' development and sociological issues. I want to rein that right back to say, what do we know about the pedagogies from P to 12? Let's not segment middle schooling and say what's middle schooling pedagogy, as to say what's the pedagogical framing from the early years to year 12. So initial teacher education preparedness to teach writing, what do we know? I just wanted to make sure there was a slide in here that you could see what the survey actually looked like before we present any of the data, because you'll see various grabs on the way through, but we have not prepared and minimally prepared. And then we have these three, which in the discussion about preparedness come to be combined. So preparedness is going to include adequately, considerably, and extensively. And this was one of those surveys where people could make their choices and leave and come back to it. So we were quite encouraged by the response rate. Initial teacher education. Okay, how many of us are in that bracket? Teaching 0 to 4 years. Okay, how many of us in here? The majority, and how many of us are in here? Okay, so we got the full range. So let's just say handwriting. Is there any surprises here that in the 0 to 4, initial teacher education, years taught and preparedness, 14.6 said, remember those three categories of preparedness, that's the level of preparedness to teach handwriting. Now, if I'm not in the early years, I wasn't prepared, really, to teach handwriting. So you have to actually think back on, when we get into the phases, what does it mean, re-phases? But if you have a look at this, grammar, spelling, punctuation, sentence structure, and paragraphing, there are some pretty stunning, this is going to be a bit of a workout, folks, some pretty stunning percentages here. 26.8%, 39, 35. These people, you might say, oh, these people are the ones saying those three categories of preparation, that's low. But relative to this, before we go too hard on teacher education, this is what teachers said when they'd been out for 0 to 4 years. It's a stronger response than for teachers who have been out for a longer period of time. And then, of course, you've got your 20 years. So how many of you were prepared to teach grammar? If I may be so rude. Were you prepared to teach grammar? How many of you have a grammar? Sorry, how many of us have a grammar? I don't care what grammar. Systemic, functional, traditional. Okay. And you learnt it in English? In learning a language? Where did you learn your grammar? Learning foreign language?
Yeah. University linguistics.
University linguistics. So you're a systemic, functional person?
No. I learned a few grammars, but when I teach I use traditional.
Traditional?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think this is an interesting starting of a pattern, but then you think, okay, if these people have been out, now you're asking, I'm thinking about the policy people, what's the significance of this if you are in policy for teachers' professional learning needs? And there's a picture in here about some of this that actually shows that professional learning is being picked up by employers to address some of this emerging picture. With effect, by the way. Very positive story. We're looking for the highest areas, and that makes the point for us. Okay, modelling. So in your own expert roles, your professional roles, and then maybe in your roles as parents and carers, you've got another perspective that you bring to this. Modelling the writing process, using assessment models for marking, marking students' writing, providing feedback, and using external data. Now that's really interesting because there's a real push around developing, inverted commas, data literacy in schools. Universities have responded to that, but it's a relatively recent phenomenon in the shaping of the workforce. You know that from folk in your schools and your workforce, I expect. Any surprises there? Any things that... Any shocks, any surprises, any concerns? No, you're anticipating that. Yes?
I work with graduate teachers and early career teachers at my school, and quite a few of them have come through with strong grammatical knowledge that they're being taught at uni. I'm in that 5 to 19 year slot. I wasn't taught that stuff at high school or at uni. Our head of faculty, Chris, does a lot of in-house training for staff, upskilling us on modelling and grammar and a lot of the basics. So he's filling that need, I guess, in terms of
Yeah.
suggested.
So I think questions we can think about is does it mean to build a sustainable professional learning community in our schools when we've got this sort of information? How can we use it for that purpose as well? One of the issues I think about teacher education is universities don't have actual access to authentic data very much to do this marking. And a lot of this work goes to the schools in the professional experience time. And that's where much of this is actually learned as real. My question to you is that good enough? Could we look at a situation where universities and schools partnered with sectors for sharing authentic data to develop these capabilities in our pre-service teachers and in our workforce together? So access to real data for this purpose, I think, is an area for action. So in this, just as an intro, teachers perceive that they're underprepared for teaching and assessing writing. Heavy reliance on the employing authorities. And then, of course, we've had this report, Action Now, Classroom Ready Teachers, which is calling for interventions in the teacher preparation to address issues like building assessment capabilities and building other capabilities that look at how we can strengthen the pedagogical focus to look at quality learning for all students. Opportunity to learn, you're familiar with that term perhaps from the United States, opportunity to learn? Okay, I just put it to you this afternoon that it's an interesting notion for us to explore. It's different from entitlement. It's saying, what is the actual opportunity to learn that we're providing our young people? What are the opportunities? What do we know about the opportunities? Who gets what opportunities to learn what? So we're going to unpack that a little bit, and I will pass to my colleague, Christine. We're going to have to do this as a two-step. There you go.
Thank you.
I'd love to have one of those buzzers, you know, where when we say something that you strongly disagree with, we could know what's happening.
Now, hello. I'm Christine Jackson, as Claire introduced, and I'm presenting the first part of the data. Now, just to be upfront, we're trialling a new approach to presenting data, representation. The idea is to highlight the findings and also picking up the big ideas. It's not in a traditional format, it's in a more visual representation. There's a lot of colour. So we're trialling this new way of presenting. You can give us feedback at the end if you think it's worthwhile and useful. So the section I'm about to present is looking at pre-writing activities. We're looking at analysis of the time that teachers spent teaching or completing writing skills and strategies in the classroom. It's going to be examining 3 questions relating to the teaching of writing and 1 question relating to the teaching of language. The questions that we asked the teachers, they had to indicate on a 5-point scale how often they teach a variety of skills and strategies, as you can see there. For the purpose of the presentation, we'll be looking at the frequency of regularly using these skills and strategies, and we're interpreting that as regularly or during most lessons. So we're grouping those 2 there. The analysis will be looking at 4 stages of learning, or junctures, as we're going to introduce the concept. P to 2, 3 to 6, 7 to 10, and 11 to 12. The group's stages stem from the identification by the teachers as to the class they specifically were focusing on for the survey, and it's over a fortnightly period. Okay, so thinking about your identified class in the past fortnight, have your students completed any of the following pre-writing activities, which you can see there? Just to reiterate again, the definition of progression and plateau. So when we're presenting this data, we'll be looking at progression as in increase or a decrease, and a plateauing, and that will be represented through an arrowing system, which you'll see. So our reference category was prep to year 2. As you can see, there's these 7 particular skills, and I probably should point out straight up that, for example, you need to use a critical eye when you're looking at this. So online searching for preppies may not be as significantly or frequently taught as perhaps you would expect in the later years. So use a critical eye when you're looking at this data, and it's just a presentation. It's not to infer that it should or should not be happening. Okay, so we start with online searching, 6%, graphic organising, 27%, brainstorming, 59%, a lot happening there. Reading research on a topic, 24%, now that's explainable. Drafting a working plan, note making, and word and concept maps. Now I'm now going to move to the next juncture, which is the 3 to 6 juncture. And what we can see is the start of an upward progression. In the online search, we've now moved to 20%. Graphic organisers are now used more often, 45%. But we have a bit of a plateauing around the brainstorming, so similar from P to 2 to 3 to 6. That's still quite relevant. Reading research on a topic suddenly increases. Drafting a working plan, note making, word and concept maps. And you're looking at 73% of teachers integrating with drafting a working plan that they're doing this regularly or during most lessons. So just to reiterate that. Now the next one is the juncture from 7 to 10. And we start to see a change in the frequency that teachers are engaging with these explicit pre-writing activities. Online search plateaus. We see graphic organisation goes down. Brainstorming goes down. Reading and research on a topic is a progression up. Drafting a working plan, note making goes up, and word and concept maps start to plateau. Then we move to the next one, which is the 11 to 12, and you can see that there is a more of a plateau pattern here between 7 to 10 and 11 to 12. There is an increase in online searching in your senior years, as well as reading and research on a topic and brainstorming, which you probably would expect that would happen. But it's interesting that drafting a working plan just plateaus out as well. Any comments on that at all? Any reflection? No? Okay. So that was the first pre-writing question. So the next one was we were looking at thinking about your identified class. Which of the following have you explicitly taught to your students in the past fortnight? So we've gone from a pre-writing activity, so we're now in the explicit writing stages. So The 9 that we looked at, you can see handwriting, punctuation, sentence structure, structuring paragraphs, text cohesion, contextual grammar, spelling, keyboarding skills. Now once again, you need to use a lens to think how appropriate it is per juncture. For example, handwriting may be relevant according to the different junctures or stages of learning. So the first analysis that I'm going to talk about today is the negative progression. So in terms of the 9 basic writing skills that we listed, the predicted probability of regularly teaching those 4 items, handwriting, spelling, punctuation and sentence structure, was highest at the P to 2 and was lowest at the 11 to 12. Now, as you can as was sort of implied, you don't want handwriting necessarily to be the main focus in year 11 and 12, but it's interesting the other ones negatively progressed through the junctures of and stages of learning. So it's what I suppose we're presenting here is it was a negative rather than a positive progression in these basic skills.
You surprised? No. So it's happening in 3 to 6 and it weakens thereafter for what we're looking at here. Okay? That's good? No, I think it's good that it's resonating with your experience. You see, part of this is actually giving back from here to experts who are in the field to say, does this resonate with what you're finding? So that's why it's good.
Do you find that's reflective of the curriculum though too? Those progressions that we saw?
Well, the previous one.
Let's go back. I actually think what I know about young people's learning in curriculum areas, I would think that would need to be taught right through to middle schooling and into senior schooling. As you learn to write in economics or health and physical education or science, you would think that would stay right up there.
As a general capability.
As a general capability, yeah. So I get concerned when I see that, yeah.
Drops off straight away.
Because I don't think we've actually got the message of teaching literacy and teaching writing in curriculum areas, and there are certain assumptions made after you get through this phase here that you know how to write and you know how to read. And I think if there's one message from this is to say you need to stop that and actually say teaching writing has to happen right through to 11 and 12.
So this slide, as distinct from the next one, is a negative progression. The next one here, the basic writing skills, which make up the other 4 of the 9 that was part of the question, they significantly fell between the 3 to 6 was at the highest, then 7 to 10 fell, and then it plateaued from 11 to 12. So I guess that's picking up Claire's point. Things like text cohesion, text structure, contextual grammar are all relevant skills that you would assume would continue on with frequency and regularity in teaching post 3 to 6, but the responses indicated that it significantly fell post 3 to 6. Now the one exception was structuring paragraphs, where it was consistent in terms of it didn't fall between 3 to 6 to 7 to 10. It had a more consistent frequency of teaching between the junctures. What about that one? Does that one surprise you? Any comments on this one? Self-assessment, journal writing, vocabulary development, revising, editing, rewriting, peer editing, direct instruction or joint or guided construction. Once again, the lens of is journal writing that important in year 11 and 12 needs to be applied to this as well, because obviously the explicit writing of all this can be specific to the junctures or stages of learning. So what we found is modelling was regularly taught a lot across stages of junctures of learning. So we had 91% P to 2, 3 to 6, 74, 73, 70. So there was a fairly consistent regularly teaching these particular skills. Look at joint or guided instruction. Once again, we're over 50% for all stages or junctures of learning. And the last one was direct instruction. So it's fairly consistent in terms of regularly, so regularly or during most lessons, teaching these explicit writing. Okay, so the frequency of teaching these methods in terms of a chain of teaching progression, a significant fall in 7 to 10, meaning that the predicted probability of regularly teaching of a method was significantly lower than in the preceding 3 to 6 schooling stage for 5 writing methods. So that was group work, peer editing, self-assessment, journal writing and vocabulary development. So once again, it spiked in 3 to 6, that was the highest amount, and then it fell and plateaued in year 11 and 12. The one exception was revising and editing, where there was actually a spike in year 11 and 12, which makes a lot of sense. But once again, journal writing, is that so necessary perhaps in 7 to 10, but maybe in year 11 to 12 there's an explanation for why that wouldn't be such a focus of explicit teaching. Now, we're moving to the last question in this analysis, and this is Claire's going to jump in here, which is the language in use.
The point that I don't need the microphone.
Yeah.
Do I, Alex? Yes, I do. The key issue I'd like to draw your attention to here is you can see spelling rules and irregular spelling. We can say 77 and 67%. That you might say, well, that's fine. That's a fairly high percentage of people saying they're regularly doing that, most lessons. My mind goes to the percentage not doing it. And the opportunity to learn for all children seems to depend on what class I'm in or my teacher. And is that good enough? Or should we have some clear expectations of opportunities to learn these things for all teachers and all students? Because the meaning and use of everyday words, and then you look at the punctuation, and 51%. If we take that back to our ITE, it's gone up, which means that the employing authorities is actually impacting the practices that people are reporting they're doing. So PD matters as we're thinking about the sorts of PD that we're wanting to offer. Knowledge about written language, select how often you regularly, and you can say, teach the function of clauses, teach cohesion through the use of cohesive devices. Now I'm going to put to you that the quality of text that young people produce, irrespective of whether it's online or by traditional technology, is dependent on their control of cohesion. An expert writer has control of cohesion. Agreed? And yet when I see teach the function of clauses, goes back to your point. 30%, 30%, 48%, 36%. Another way to say that is more than half of the participating teachers are not spending time doing that. Did anybody feel a bit of a movement there of concern? because actually I don't think you can develop expertise in writing unless you've got control over functions of clauses and use of cohesive devices. And that would be in all curriculum areas. And I think if you're an avid reader, you learn some of that vicariously. And if you're in language-rich environments, in other contexts outside of school, you can learn that. It's modelled for you. But in fact, that means the development of expertise is as much dependent on what happens in those contexts as it is in the classroom. So I think I'm arguing the case for the teaching of cohesion and the function of clauses to be part of the preparation for all teachers in all subjects. And we're well short of a shared position on that, I think. We've had a long time. What have we had? Literacy across the curriculum, and then we had literacy demands in the curriculum. And I think we actually have to say now it's priority around reading, and we know that reading results are stronger than writing. And I'm saying now it's time for writing and reading together, and to actually focus on expertise of teachers in teaching these aspects. How much time did your students spend on sustained writing? I want you to tell me when you feel that buzzer that you want to send. Less than 1 hour was low, 1 to 5 hours, and 5 or more hours. How much time did they spend on sustained writing in a classroom? Not the assignment that we set. In the classroom. How much time do they actually have?
Sorry, Claire, I just missed the bit. In over what period do they spend?
Fortnight?
A fortnight.
So here you could say 1 to 5 hours over 10 days of schooling. 60% of our participants said that's the amount of time they spent. Approximately even representation of primaries and secondaries. For those folk who are very interested in the multivariate analysis that inform these figures, we'd love to actually sit and have a long coffee to share the analyses, and I'm genuine there, because if we have people who are very interested in this sort of work, we'd like to continue the dialogue in real terms around what does this say about how we can strengthen the capabilities. And our shared collective, as I said from the very beginning, is our young people. And clearly the teachers are interested in that as well. Whether we've got the clarity of messages to them at the moment is another thing. The length of sustained time. You said the magic word paragraph. The strongest one. What was the length of sustained writing? 13% a few sentences, 46% a paragraph, 32 up to a page, and 9% more than a page. Some people are saying, Would you have liked to have seen more than a page, more strongly represented, when we've got secondary humanities subjects, for instance? Yes?
Well, there's the other issue, Claire, that in the previous slide we had about 60%, I think it was, of people spending 1 to
5.
hours, and here the production out of that is kind of between a paragraph and maybe up to a page after 1 to 5 hours.
Yes. And I think good paragraphs are hard to write. I'm not diminishing the importance of the paragraph, and I'm not saying more is better. But if we actually think of the opportunity to write and what they're writing, and this is what our colleagues are saying to us, more than a page is, I think, thinly represented there. Now this is when we can start to ask questions about assessment and standards and goal setting. And I want to say at the very beginning that teachers are, at the moment, managing competing demands from commercial products, from packages of all sorts, from multiple standards, and they're taking up those multiple standards without necessarily any of the, I'm going to say, guidance as to the coherence across those resources that are being used, especially when it comes to standards. Some of our teachers said they were using 6 different sets of standards. So 44% regularly and during most lessons directed students to evaluate their own writing against stated expectations of quality. 30% rarely or never directed students to collaborate. 66% reported being able to use writing data to identify students' current level, which I think is a very encouraging figure. How to use it for next step teaching. I do the teaching, students do the learning, the piece of work is done. The key question is, how do I use that for next step teaching? And in another dimension of this project, when we were talking to teachers about their work in the classroom, in supporting writing, and specifically in the assessment space, there was a clear statement that says, we've finished, we've got to move on.
And where are they checking for that? Are they including some form of assessment around the writing so that they know what to teach before the actual summative piece is due?
But even after the summative piece,
Absolutely, informing your next
Yeah.
steps. But
I mean, what do you know about that? What you have to reteach. And so the question is there some time built into teachers' year about reteaching? Because I'm a firm believer, unless people have a sense of firmness to proceed, and the teachers have a sense of firmness to proceed with confidence about what the learning needs and what the level is, we actually build in failure. And I think in a lot of our circumstances, we have a 1-year window, and we have one subject window, and we do well to progress through a rich curriculum, but we don't do well in this next step teaching for building from instructional moment to instructional moment. 37% never or rarely engage students in goal setting. I was told of a really interesting practice in Taiwan, and I was wondering, I wonder how Australian students would manage this. The very beginning of the day, there's a half an hour given over, this was at least in schools where this was attempted, for students to set goals, what it is they want to achieve in their day. And the last part of the day was a little bit of time given over to say, did you achieve the goal, and what does it mean for tomorrow? I thought, wouldn't that be interesting to see if that was a routine part of pedagogy?
That's not really surprising, is it? If 40% of teachers said they can't really work out what the next steps are, they're not really in a position to then teach students how to look at their work and decide on goals with them. Are they? So it's 37 and 40 kind of go hand in hand.
And that's where I think it's the era of expertise. I was interested to read in the newspaper, perhaps you saw it, there was a principal saying, it was about phonics, the teaching of phonics. You might have seen it, and the principal was saying, it's actually not drill and practice as a mindless activity, it's just about practice. And if you want to get good at something, you have to practice it. And Christine and I have been playing around with the notion of writing fitness, you know, that notion of practicing the writing practice to build that expertise. So have a look at this. Standards on a 5-point reporting scale. Number and percentages using standards by school stage. So these are what they told us were standards that they were using. competing demands on teachers to try to reconcile the different standards. So we've got school-based, we've got national, we've got standardised testing, and we get to the expert writing teachers, which is what we were talking about before. And I think we have to, in the new era of expertise, address teachers' dispositions. Dispositions to themselves as teachers and dispositions to themselves as writers. We could have a great conversation around what you routinely write. And I mean, I suspect you'd say emails. It features right up there, but certainly does for a lot of colleagues. So let's just say key messages from where we've been: the building of expertise. Might be around working with students with goal setting. Might be around the cohesive ties, the teaching of clauses, a coherent set of expectations around what does it count as an expert writing teacher. I think it's time for an explicit focus on the teaching of writing. Time to write. The research shows that if we build in an extra 15 minutes regularly, a couple of times a week, you can expect improvement. A little bit of time in the class for time to write equals opportunity to learn. The competing standards, understanding how people are using the standards, and the initial teacher education we've just talked about. Big messages, proposals for us to think about: headlining writing, connecting writing and learning to write and writing to learn in the curriculum areas. We don't have a compelling evidence base at the moment, and we've got the potential for the AWS to be, by a longitudinal investment, I mean a repeat measure, not every year, but at targeted intervals. I think there's merit in considering a writing curriculum, and that would actually link the teaching, learning, the assessment, the use of data, and the next step teaching. The clarity around quality writing and what it means. So the opportunity for schools to develop exemplars, which I suspect many of you have already done, to show what quality looks like in writing in the curriculum areas, together with the assessment and the standards. And I'm going to suggest here, time to write can't be understated. Time to write. Time to think about how I'm developing as a writer. So if you open all this Pandora's box, we've got the chance to measure change in the impact of teaching on student learning and their writing. So if schools and systems are interested in this question, we'd love to work with you.